Okay, so we'll just start and begin setting our motivation and sort of give a brief introduction, I suppose, before we really start. So I think from Tenzin's request to cover stuff about refuge and the suffering of the lower realms, I thought it'd be good to do a series on refuge and the causes of refuge and the objects of refuge and how we take refuge and the commitments and so on. So beginning tonight with the causes of refuge. And you see, we'll look at the three scopes of the causes of refuge and how they are interlinked and the practices that you do for each and the common practices, I suppose. So with this in mind, we'll set a motivation for the session, thinking we're going to take part in this because without the valid refuge, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, how can we attain liberation? And we need to understand how to correctly take refuge and to have the, because without this genuine refuge, our Dharma practice isn't very pure and is very weak. So thinking if we're going to liberate all other sentient beings, then we need to have a solid foundation of refuge. So visualizing in the space in front, Buddha Shakyamuni surrounded by the lineages of method and wisdom, as well as all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the Prateka Buddhas, the Arhats, Dharma protectors, lineage lamas above, and so on. And think we ourselves are surrounded by all sentient beings who are in the aspect of humans, and we're going to lead them in reciting the prayers. So we said the praise to Buddha Shakyamuni. Guru, teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly complete Buddha, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and humans, Jew Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Guru, teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly complete Buddha, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and humans, Jew Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Guru, teacher of Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfect complete Buddha, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and humans, Jew Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then the mantra. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Mahamunaye Soha. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Mahamunaye Soha. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Mahamunaye Soha. And then they praise the perfection of wisdom, the inexpressible, inconceivable, indescribable perfection of wisdom, unproduced, unceasing, the nature of space, object of the uniquely knowing transcendental wisdom. To Mother victorious sponsor 3 times, I prostrate. And the mantra. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasangati Bodhi Soha. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasangati Bodhi Soha. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasangati Bodhi Soha. Then we'll offer a mandala. Oh. Sashiboki Yoshimeto Tamlirali Nidegenpadi Sangye Shindu Mixi Oadi Dokunanda Jina Chopasho Jetsun Lama 기초그가라 기세주진투 지타삼배 두지지마라 자기 조기 자가 라투소 이랑 그etna mandala kamniatayami 상계 조랑선이 조남 자주 봐도 다니 캡수치 다기 주님 깊이서 난기 돌아 벤치 상계 루퍼 쇼 상계 조랑선이 조남 자주 봐도 다니 캡수치 다기 진서 깊이서 난기 돌아 벤치 상계 루퍼 쇼 상계 조랑선이 조남 Janju Badu Dani Kyabsuchi Dagi Jinso Kipe Sonamgi Tuola Penchi Sangye Rupo Sho. Okay, so then begin today thinking about the causes of taking refuge. So generally it's described there are three causes of taking refuge. And the three depend on your scope of your capacity as a person, depending what your abilities to practice right now and how much you can practice and so on depends on your scope. So the first, which is the lesser scope or small scope, the cause of this type of refuge is fear of suffering of the lower realms. You want happiness in this and future lifetimes, and you want to avoid suffering in this and future lifetime. And then there's the middling scope, where you realize that there's suffering in not just the lower realms. So you then realize that all happiness in samsara is contaminated. So you then think, okay, it's not enough just to have happiness in this life and be reborn in the higher realms in future lives. You need to attain liberation from samsara. And then finally, the great scope. And this is going a step further. You think, okay, I don't want to suffer in samsara at all. I want to attain complete liberation. All these sentient beings who've been my mother since beginningless time also don't want to suffer. So in this way, I'll lead them all to enlightenment. So you can see that the small scope isn't someone that's aiming for liberation. They just want happiness. And, it's a fairly common mode of refuge. You find a lot of people look down on this, especially in the West, practitioners look down on it. Because these kind of Buddhists mainly just partake in merit making exercises. You see it a lot in Buddhist cultural countries, seen especially in Thailand, a lot of lay people where they don't have the capacity to become a monk. They just don't really practice the Dharma like in as much depth. They just engage in virtue non-stop because they have an aspiration in their future lives to be able to be a monk and become an arhat. Because that's the culture. They don't see about lay people being able to attain liberation. They only see it as a monk can attain liberation. So in this way, that's quite a common approach. And then the middling approach of liberation for ourselves alone, it's kind of the motivation that our heart has. Whereas the great scope is then the motivation of a bodhisattva. So then what do we actually do? We think these are the three causes of generating refuge. Fear of the lower realms, the fear of samsara in general, and then the fear of samsara for ourselves and others. So there are two main meditations to be done. Oh, well, sort of three, I suppose, actually, when you think about it. So the first one you need to consider is impermanence. If you acknowledge you're going to die, then you start thinking about future lives, what's next. So I suppose in a sense, it kind of is built on the assumption you believe in future lifetimes. So perhaps that's the contemplation you need to take in first about the continuity of consciousness, and there is future lifetime. And then thinking, okay, so I will die. I don't know when I'll die, but it will happen. Like we've discussed in the past. Um, Thinking that this death is certain, the time of death is uncertain. Then you think, well, what will help me at the time of my death? And then you think, well, I can't take wealth, belongings, loved ones, or even my body with me. Anyway, this body's like a guest house. You just leave it behind. Your consciousness travels from life to life. So in this way, then it depends on your karma. And we see about the definiteness of karma. This is the second meditation. And this is the main meditation of someone on the lower scope. These two meditations belong to the lower scope. They see that they will die and they've acknowledged they're going to die. And then from there, they think, okay, I will die, but what's going to happen? I'll be reborn on depending on my karma. So virtue leads to happiness, and non-virtue leads to suffering. Okay, it's very clear in this way. The Buddha was very explicit, and in our own lives, we can even see this. People who commit lots of virtue are generally quite happy people, whereas people who aren't, who have poor ethics and so on, generally suffer a lot. And obviously, you can think about rich and famous people who do things wrong, but we don't know how their karma is going to ripen in future lifetimes. So in this way, you think about this, and you think the karma is increasing. The more you commit to virtue, the more you habituate yourself to virtue. And then the more virtue you'll commit again and again and so on. So eventually it becomes a circle. The more virtue you commit, the more likely you are to commit more virtue in the future. So you'll have happiness in this and future lifetimes. So these two meditations are the key meditations for the lower scope. And I think we're both quite aware of this. You've meditated on this quite a bit, and we've discussed these two before. And then the third part of the lower scope, and this also constitutes half of the meditation for the middling scope, is okay, so you now know you need for happiness, you must commit virtue and abandon non-virtue. And then you think, well, what's going to happen when I die? So you need to contemplate the suffering of the lower realms. And you think about the causes of being reborn in the lower realms. And then think, if I don't want this suffering, I must act in a way that is the opposite of these causes. So if you want rebirth as a human, for example, you need to have enough positive karma to be reborn as a human. You need to have pure ethics or, sense of morality. And you need to have the wish to be born as a human. And then for the other higher realms, to be reborn as as an asura and a deva and an asura, you have these similar sort of wishes, a lot of virtue, pure ethics. But also you may have practiced calm abiding and developed an attachment to this bliss. And this causes those rebirth. So then we'll start off by looking at the lower realms. The suffering of these lower realms is what you must meditate on. Because if you don't know what suffering these realms have, how can you wish to be free of it? It's the same with if you don't acknowledge the suffering of samsara, you'll never want to be free of it, because you won't see there is any suffering there. So let's maybe start with animals. We'll do it in the opposite way around to normal. Because animals, people often think about as not suffering. You see people talk about animals and, oh, I'd like to be reborn as an animal, because they seem very happy and they have a quiet, peaceful life. They don't have to go to work like humans do. But then if you actually stop and examine animals carefully, they suffer greatly. You have the general sufferings that are common to all animals. Heat and cold and so on. They're similar to humans, they struggle to keep themselves safe. You know, they don't necessarily, they're always looking for shelter and somewhere to avoid bad weather and things. And animals can't build houses the same as humans can't, so they kind of suffer more there. Then they suffer the effects of basically the effects of their karma. So whether you're born as a predator or a prey animal depends on your karma. But then if you're born as a predator, people think, oh, predators just kill without intention, so they don't generate negative karma from it. But it's not really true. These predators do have an intention to kill. They go through the motions, as we've seen when we've studied karma, we've thought about karma in the past. They identify a target, they identify their prey, and then they have the motivation, which is generally hunger, I suppose, for an animal. And then going from there, they have the act of killing with this intention to kill. It's not that they don't want to kill the animal, because if they don't kill, they know if they don't kill the animal, they can't eat. So they do have an intention to do that, which is why it's said being reborn as a predatory animal is very sad because you generate so much negative karma because you're constantly killing and planning on killing and things. So we can see those kinds of sufferings. And then animals that are put to work, horses get beaten and so on. All kind of work animals suffer greatly in that way you can think about. And then even animals that don't suffer as obviously, like pets, they still suffer. They get sad when you leave them. And they suffer with being separated and so on. And it's very difficult for animals because they don't understand what's going on all the time. And that lack of understanding means they suffer as well. So there's a good example for this that always made the suffering of pets very clear for me. Is the So Jamyan in London had a centre cat called Dorje, and he had a sister called I think the sister was called Ganta, or the Sanskrit for bell. I'm not 100% certain, because his sister was killed long before I visited Jamyan, and Dorje had seen this happen, and so he knew cars were dangerous because he'd seen a car kill his sister. So it made him very scared of cars. If he heard one in the street, he'd get very nervous. And then when Dorje got sick, he had the general suffering of sickness, like we all do. We wanted to be free of it. So he'd come up to you and make his displeasure known about this sort of sickness in his paw, sort of in his wrist joint on his leg. And it was very sore for him. But Dorje didn't like to go to the vet. He was a very difficult cat in that way. Uh, you know, it would take two or three of us to catch him. You'd have to lock him in a room, and one of you would have to throw a blanket over him and grab him and try and get him in the crate because you couldn't trick him in the crate with food. He'd learned to avoid that. Um, you had to throw a blanket over him and grab him. It was very difficult because it scared him a lot. And then, all the way to the vet, he'd be in this crate, you'd carry him down the street, and he'd again start fighting and get scared because he didn't like being outside because all he could hear was cars and there was a lot of fear going on. And then when he got to the vet, he would kind of relax and then he'd see other animals and he'd get scared again. So in some ways, he was easily scared as a cat, which made it even worse. But you can kind of see there that he was a very well taken care of and loved cat. He had 2 meals a day, all the attention of different volunteers and visitors to the centre that you could possibly want. But that didn't stop him from suffering. And what was causing him to suffer was actually what was trying to help him avoid further suffering. But he just didn't understand that we had to take him to the vet so he didn't hurt himself again. So in that way, you can kind of see all pets are quite a good example of not understanding. So then, okay, we don't want to be reborn as an animal. And then there's the predators, the hungry ghosts. So when you actually read the descriptions of which spirits belong to the predators, there's a huge number of spirits. But normally when we just meditate on the predator realm, we just focus on the very common hungry ghost. We don't think about the other kind of spirits. Just because it gets too complicated, it takes a long time, and these are the main ones. And the sufferings are all fairly similar, you know, just like animals, they suffer from the environment. They don't want too much heat, they don't want too much cold, those kind of sufferings. And the suffering that's uncommon to the predators, this is the suffering of hunger and thirst. So everyone has hunger and thirst, but it's more extreme in this realm. So the three lower realms have an aspect of suffering that's emphasized. For the animals, it's kind of suffering due to stupidity, it's emphasized. And not on it's ignorance, basically. Whereas, and this relates to the affliction that's key to this realm. So the affliction that's key to the animal realm is ignorance. The affliction that's key to the hungry ghost realm is miserliness. So because rebirth in a hungry ghost depends on being miserly. So the antidote to avoid being bound there is to be practice generosity. So the three main categories of hungry ghosts, there's little subdivisions we'll come on to, and there's then some that don't count in amongst these. So the first, I suppose we'll start with the coarsest. The first don't see food and drink at all. They have very swollen bellies and narrow throats. They want to drink water, they want to eat food, but they just can't see it at all. They can look at a plate of food and it's just an empty plate. Or they can see a lake and it's just a dry land. They don't see any of it. And then some that do see food and drink, but to them it appears as disgusting. So the water appears as pus and food appears as feces. They don't actually see it in its true, how it is. They just have this misconception. So even though they want to eat and drink it, they don't realize it's food to eat and drink it. And then there's some that do see food and drink. No, I should say the last category of the three are the ones that see food and drink as food and drink, but they have obstacles to being able to receive the food and drink. So there is two types. So the first ones see it as food and drink, and then they go to eat and drink. They maybe take the food, and just as they're about to put it into their mouth, it transforms from being food into being feces. And water transforms into pus just as they're about to drink it. So these beings get so close to being able to satisfy themselves and have what they need, and then it's just taken away. And then the other category can actually be divided again. But there's no point maybe getting too technical here. But basically, it stays as food and drink. They see it as food and drink. It stays as food and drink for them. So they can even put it in their mouth. But then when they go to swallow it, they're just unable to swallow. Their throat's too narrow to even be able to drink a drop of water or eat a mouthful of food, morsel of food. And some of these actually, they say that throats burn. It's like when they go to drink water, it's like drinking molten lead. They're not able to actually drink it because it's so painful for them. So you can kind of think about the coarsest level of hunger we have as humans. If there's pangs of hunger and things, and the illness you can kind of get from dehydration. So you can meditate on those and contemplate how you experience hunger and thirst. And then imagine how much worse it must be for a predator who's just never able to have things. And then some of the predators, just looking at food and drink causes it to vanish. So it's said that if they see a lake, it just causes a lake to dry up. Or if they look at a field of wheat, all the wheat just dies instantly and the crops fail. So actually, there are some rituals used to be done sort of pre the introduction of Buddhism to Tibet. There's some kind of folk rituals, and I think these were common in Nepal and maybe in India too. But the stories I've heard are Tibetan, where these ritual masters would basically whip the hungry ghosts. They do kind of rituals. I don't exactly know how they work, but you kind of see the similar tools used in certain Buddhist rituals, but used out of compassion, whereas this wasn't necessarily out of compassion. And they just whip them and beat them because they would cause crops to fail, harvests to fail, so they would cause big obstacles for the local people. So they would get the pre-Buddhist lamas, I suppose, as they often get called, to come and beat the hungry ghosts out of the region. So there's a kind of suffering there as well because they don't intend to do this. And then they get abused and beaten for it. Then you can kind of think, okay, so they have this suffering. They get abused and beaten and so forth. So then we don't want to be reborn as a hungry ghost because there's just so much suffering in this realm. And then we have the hell realms. The hot and the cold, the intermediate hells. So to give you a brief summary of them, we'll start off with the hot realms. So there's many different hot realms. You can kind of read different. The Lamrim Chenmo, and the Middle Length Lamrim explain them. Various commentaries do. Jingmi Lingpa's Yonten Zo, the Treasure of Precious Qualities, that explains the lower realms in detail too. And Longchenpa's Trilogy of Rest does as well. And basically all non-preliminary practice commentaries and non-Dro commentaries do explain these various lower realms in great detail. So like Words My Perfect Teacher as well goes into great detail on these realms. But in essence, so the hell realms are a place of great suffering. So in the hot realms is ones where there's what's it, a burning house it's called, and they're kind of trapped in this iron house that's on fire, so they're being cooked alive. And then there's the pressing hell where they're being crushed by heavy rocks, constantly having weight applied to them. These various hell realms where they're being impaled on spears and tridents and put into pots of burning oil. And then there's also one, I think it's called the Great Clapping Hell. And what happens here is you are kind of born on this great battlefield with weapons, and you go and everyone fights until there's one survivor left. And then a big bell rings and everyone's revived. So that's what it's called. It's called the reviving hell. You fight until there's one person left and everyone's revived, and you fight again. And again. And again. And again until your karma is exhausted. So you can see there's a huge amount of suffering there. And because the hell realms are generated by your mind, there's no external beings torturing you in the hell realms. It makes the reviving hell quite interesting because the traditional commentaries describe how you have spears and swords, but then a few different lamas and people I've had discussions with about this have suggested that actually it probably changes, for modern people, because we're used to battles with guns and so on rather than just swords and knives. They probably are born with guns and other weapons. I think because it's a mental habituation, it depends on what weaponry you're used to. So it kind of depends on culture. But you can kind of then think about how much suffering is involved in human war and human conflict. And imagine this is just so much more extreme. And you have all these various hot hells then. So basically a place of huge suffering. And the same with the cold hells. The names of the cold hell realms are a bit more complicated to translate because they They're basically phonetic. So they're based on the sound you make based on how cold you are. So you have like what sometimes translated as the shivering hell or the burr, and then the great shivering hell or the great burr hell. Because basically you start off with this one and you're in this horrible environment where it's very cold, wet, and windy. And in the first one, it's the blistering hell, I think. Yeah, blistering hell. So you basically are there and you're naked and the wind's blowing against you and you go red and you develop sores and blisters. I don't know if you've ever been so cold, but sometimes if you're not careful, especially on your cheeks, if it's really windy, you can get very red and start to actually burn and develop blisters after too long. And then the next step is the cracking hell. So basically, it's slightly colder. And these blisters that form, it's so cold and windy that they actually crack and leak pus on your face, and then that freezes and causes so much more pain. And it goes on, and the like there's a 16 petal lotus because you're that cold, you should shatter into 16 pieces, and a 32 petal lotus because it's even colder and you shatter into 32 pieces and so on. So the details of the cold hell realms, if you want the complete details, you can go and read up on them. But really to emphasize, it's just an increasing level of coldness. So again, if you're wanting to meditate on this, just think about the coldest and wettest you've ever been in your life and how miserable that is and how much suffering you end up having to endure because of it. So then from there, think, okay, well, I don't want to suffer in this way anymore. And then we have the intermediate hells. And these, again, it's said that when you basically, as you start to burn out through your negative karma, that's the cause of rebirth in these hell realms. You move out of the central hell realms into the edge hell realms, these intermediate hell realms. So these kind of four key ones is one, the burning embers. So basically, you're trying to like wade through it. You can see the way out of the hell realms. So you're walking towards them, and you're like going through this swamp that's full of, rather than being mud and water, it's like burning embers that burns through your skin and causes great pain. And then you have one where great cutting. I can't remember the names of these hells. Sorry. Um, but I suppose the names aren't important. What's important is this kind of contemplation of the actual suffering you endure. And knowing names kind of doesn't really matter to do your practice. It's just useful academic knowledge. So like you think you're being chased by wild dogs, you can hear them behind you barking all the time. So you're running along, and then maybe in some there are these dogs chasing you, and as they catch you, you maybe go to climb trees to get away from them. But it's said that the trees have thorns that point down as you try and climb up, so you get cut as you climb up. And then when the dogs go and you try and climb back down, the thorns turn around and point upwards, so you get stabbed again. And as you're running along the floor, there's like razor blades in the floor. And there's another one where it's just a sort of similar thing. You can see the exit and you're going through this jungle, but these vines that drop down and cover the jungle surface are full of like razor blades and sharp objects. And then the final one is like a river. And you've basically got to swim across this. You've got to get across this river to get out of hell. But the river is a river of acid, so it burns you as you get in it. And then there's these hell beings again who are fishing you out of the river on a trident, a fishing rod kind of thing. And then they hammer your body and they crush you and things. So you can kind of see there's just similar to the core hell realms, it's just an immense amount of suffering. So you need to contemplate this as part of the contemplation of a being of the lower path or a person of lower capacity. So now you can see if you've meditated on how there's just no suffering. Death is certain, but the time of death is uncertain. And when you die, you'll be reborn according to your karma. Nothing you can do to help with that. Then you'll think, okay, so I now know I'm being a reborn on depends on my karma. What happens? What will my karma lead to? So if you have too much anger, and you're too much anger and violence basically is the cause of suffering in the hell realms, birth in the hell realms. So you think, okay, that's the cause, and that's the suffering I'm going to endure. I don't want to endure that. I will practice the opposite, which is practicing non-violence, non-harm. And then you think, okay, what realm's next? We're at the predators, the hungry ghosts. And then you think, right, so the cause of being reborn there is being miserly. So if I see this suffering and I don't want to endure this suffering, and I know the cause of this, I'll do everything I can to avoid the cause of that. So you practice generosity. And then you think, okay, what about animal realm? Let's move up another realm. So you meditate on the suffering of the animals and you think, okay, I don't want to endure this suffering. So then from there you think, right, I want to be free of the suffering of animals. How can I be free of suffering of the animals? You can be free of it by practicing morality. So then you think, okay, so I need to practice pure morality to avoid this suffering of the animal realm. Now I see what I need to do to avoid suffering of the lower realms. I need to practice virtue and abandon non-virtue. And how will I do that? Well, I'll think of the teachings of the Buddha, and we'll come on to why you maybe follow the teachings of the Buddha and see why the Buddha is a wise being in the future. But then you see the teachings of the Buddha where he clearly distinguishes what to abandon and what to adopt. Teaching the 10 virtues and the 10 non-virtues. So you think, because of this fear, I will practice the 10 virtues and abandon the 10 non-virtues. And in this way, I'll take refuge in the Buddha as the supreme guide, the Dharma as the supreme medicine, and the Sangha as the supreme support. So that's the end of the person with the lower scope. So then the person in the middling scope takes it a step further. You want to do all the previous contemplations, death and impermanence, karma, the suffering in the lower realms. And then you think, well, am I happy in the higher realms? And then you want to meditate on the suffering of the samsara in general. So you can think of the specific sufferings of humans, where we have the suffering of birth. The often babies come out crying. You come out of this nice warm womb when you're in water, essentially, in fluid. It's all very soft and gentle, and the next thing you know, you're out into the world. There's suddenly a very bright light, and there's a very rough towel being wrapped around you in comparison to, it might be a soft towel, but in comparison to what you're used to, it's a very rough towel. So you suffer there. And then with aging, we suffer. You think as a teenager, there's kind of a good example of like younger people, because the suffering of aging is very difficult for young people to understand. This is not not something I can say from experience, but something all my lamas have told me from their experience as they've gotten older. When you're young, you see yourself as invincible, and you don't suffer the same. But one that's quite useful for younger people is when you're a teenager. Like you have those growing pains, don't you? Where your body's not quite used to being, if as you get taller and your legs perhaps grow, but your muscles aren't quite used to it yet, and you get pains and get all kinds of issues, and these are all the kind of things you can think of. But it's easier as you get older, and you can see the degeneration of the body, and in family members as well, you can see how elderly relatives suffer from old age, from poor health, and so on. And then sickness, we can see this ourselves. From the moment you're sick, you just want to be free of it. It's It doesn't matter what kind of sickness you have, you just want to be free of it the moment you have it. And then when you can't be free of it, you're not really happy. It's, we all can kind of see this suffering. And some of these sufferings of human beings are the general sufferings, but we can kind of then think about our human life and how we suffer by not getting things we want, meeting things we don't want, not being separated from things we want, and so on. So the suffering of humans is quite easy to contemplate because we can think in our own life. It's not very simple all the time. We might have happiness, but eventually it'll end. So there's always some form of suffering there. And then we need to think about the other higher realms, the demigods, the asuras, and the gods, the asuras or the devas. So it's interesting. The terms are quite interesting because basically asura just means not God. You know, the Tibetan is Lami, and the Sanskrit's Asura, A being negative and Sura meaning God. Uh, in Tibetan, La means God, and Mi is the negative particle. So basically, it's kind of these sentient beings who are not gods, but don't belong to any of the lower realms, any of the other realms, the humans, the predators, the animals, the hell realms. So it's kind of a bit of a generic category, but this is because it encompasses so many different types of beings. So basically, it depends on the mind as well, like Nagas and Gandharvas and so on. They can be Asuras or they can be predators. It kind of depends. But a lot of Nagas are Asuras, for example. And so we look at the Asuras and their suffering. So they're a lot better off than we are, but they can see more of samsara than we can. They can see the formless realms. And they can see the gods and they can see how much bliss they experience. And they get jealous and think, well, I might be experiencing all this bliss, but that God over there is experiencing so much more than me. And they wish they had that, and that causes them to suffer. But also, you see, it said there's a wish fulfilling tree grows from the realm of the Asuras, and it's the top of the tree where its fruit is in the realm of the Devas. So the Asuras get very jealous. They put all this effort into looking after this wish fulfilling tree, but they don't ever see its fruit. They don't get its benefits. So they get jealous and they go to war with the Devas. And there's then basically, as you've seen in the lower realms, and as a human, they endure the suffering of war. And generally, because they're weaker than the Devas, they get killed quite easily. So, there's a lot of suffering there. It's very difficult for us to consider because they experience so much more bliss and happiness than we do. But they actually don't experience permanent bliss and happiness. They are going to suffer. And then finally, the gods are probably the hardest realm to contemplate the suffering of because they just experience bliss all the time. It's really quite challenging for us. You can think about animals and how much they suffer, and the same with demigods, same with predators and hell beings. Their suffering is quite apparent to us, but gods is a bit more challenging. So, they might be experiencing all this bliss, but when their karma is exhausted, they begin to die because they don't die through normal means like sickness and so on. They just die from the exhaustion of their karma. So at this point in the kind of stages leading up to their death, their body loses its luster and its colour, and it also kind of begins to lose its pleasant aroma. So if you read the stories of the gods, they smell of flowers all the time and beautiful perfume, and they have bright, radiant colours. And this begins to fade as they die. So not only do they suffer from losing this beautiful appearance that they're attached to, but then all the other gods know that they're dying. They can all see. So they kind of stop spending time with them and leave them on their own because no one wants to be with that one being up in your blissful realm who's smelly and not as happy anymore. It's quite miserable. So then they suffer from being alone. And then because they're omniscient, they turn their mind to the future. They think, okay, right, so I'm clearly dying. Where am I going to be reborn? And they see that they've exhausted all their virtuous karma. and that's going to be reborn in one of the three lower realms. So depending on previous negative karma, that depends which lower realm they're born in. So they now see what suffering they're going to endure. And that causes them to have great fear and so much suffering because they don't want to be reborn in this realm. But there's nothing they can do about it. So they might panic and quickly try and practice virtue, but it's too little too late at this point. Because the gods live so long, they have no interest in practicing the Dharma. Humans live for 80 or to 100 years, so you can kind of see that death is going to come. But because gods live for thousands of years, they kind of lose this memory, so they don't practice the Dharma. They have no cause to practice the Dharma. They don't see any urgency. So then it's a bit too late, and they've not been able to accumulate merit and purify negativities. They've just been enjoying themselves and having a great time. But they've wasted all this positive karma. So they're now going to suffer. So for a person on the intermediate scope, or middling scope, this is where they kind of meditate to. They think, okay, there's suffering of all three higher realms, and I want to be free of suffering and its causes. So they're not content with just being reborn in the higher realms. They quite clearly see that this is, while better than being reborn in the lower realms, still suffering. So then they generate the wish to be free of suffering. And they think, well, what is freedom from suffering? Who is free from suffering? And then they kind of, depending on the teachings of the Buddha, they see that ignorance is the cause of suffering. Someone without ignorance does not suffer. So then they have this wish to be free from samsara. But it's kind of just an individual wish, just themselves, they wish to be free from the suffering of samsara. And this is the kind of individual liberation vehicle. And then finally, for the followers of the Mahayana, they take it a step further and say, right, so not only do I don't want to suffer in samsara at all, but all these sentient beings are suffering in the same way. And I don't want to suffer like this, so therefore they don't want to suffer like this. And since we've been in samsara, since beginningless lifetimes, we've been all relations to each other. So they've been my mother, my father, my close friends, enemies, and so on. And we think we don't want our close relative, those we're close to, we don't want them to suffer. So because of all being being close to us, we don't want any of them to suffer. So then they need to be free from samsara too, not just ourselves. But then you think, okay, if I'm going to free them from samsara, how will I do it? I don't have the capacity right now. But who has the capacity to free these beings from samsara? Well, a Buddha does. Therefore, I will become a Buddha to liberate all these sentient beings from samsara. So in that way, you generate the wish to be free from samsara. And based on this, you think, okay, how will I do this? Well, first, I need to become a Buddha myself. And how will I do this? I'll do it by relying on the Buddha as the guide, the Dharma as the method, and the Sangha as the support. So you can see all three perspectives take refuge in the same objects of refuge, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Although when we go into the objects of refuge next week, we'll see it's a little more complicated in the Mahayana, because there's the outer and the inner refuge, and then in the Vajrayana there's also the secret refuge, which we won't go into. But in essence, all Buddhists take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. This is the essence. Okay, this is basically the entry to being a Buddhist, is refuge in the three jewels. So then, based on that, you practice the teachings of the Buddha, and depending on your motivation, depends on which scope you're in. And you can see it's also gradual. So a practitioner of the great scope has to do the meditations of a person of the lower scope. So also it can be progressive. You might just start off with a motivation of the lower scope and do these meditations and be happy, and then start practicing virtue and non-virtue. And then as you kind of live your human life, you might think, well, actually, this human life isn't all it's cracked up to be. I suffer a lot. So then you begin to contemplate the suffering of the higher realms. And that causes you to think, well, I want to be liberated from samsara. And then with this motivation, you start practicing and you go about your activities and so on. Then maybe you see another sentient being in particular suffering. And then you stop and think, oh, I really don't like seeing other beings suffer. So what's causing them to suffer? Well, it's the ignorance of samsara, or this, fundamental ignorance. It's the root of samsara. So then you think, well, I'll free all sentient beings from samsara. So you progress from the lower scope to the greater scope, whether it's in a single lifetime, across multiple lifetimes, or whatever. So in that way, that's the cause of taking refuge. Seeing suffering of samsara is the key. And how do we do this? We meditate on death and impermanence. We meditate on karma, and we meditate on the suffering of the various realms of samsara. So in that way, that's how we begin by taking refuge. So we'll stop there for tonight. So we've discussed the causes of refuge, and then next we'll go on to the objects of refuge. So we can quickly take some time for questions. I'll leave it there. Okay, so in that case, what we'll do is we'll dedicate the merit to this practice. And so, Dagi Jinye Sopege Wadi Tendandawa Kunaga Pedan Kipa Jetson Losan Drapai Tempe Nimpo Ringju Selze Show. And then, so we actually should dedicate for the renunciation first, because this is the key point of the teachings as well as renunciation. So it's Nejung, Tibetan for renunciation is Nejung. So it's Nejung, Nejung Sampa Rinpoche, Make Panam Kegyu Chi, Kepa Nyampa Mepaya, Gong Ne Gong Du Pelwa, Sho, Jancho Semcho Rinpoche, Make Panam Kegyu Chi, Kepa Nyampa Mepaya, Gong Ne Gong Du Pelwa, Sho. Then emptiness, Tongyi Tawa Rinpoche, Make Panam Kegyu Chi, Kepa Nyampa Mepaya, Gong Ne Gong Du Pelwa, Sho. And then the long life is Holiness Dalai Lama. Gangri Rawe Kowe Zinkan So Pendang Dewa Malu Shumwe Ne Jinre Se Wang Tenzin Gyatso Yi Jape Site Badu Tengyu Chi. Yep, continue down. So thank you very much for coming, and see you next time.